Hi there, I'm John Ivison, your host for our weekly look at the political scene in Canada. I'm joined as usual by Andrew Balfour, who is the managing partner at Rubicon Strategies, and Marcella Munro, who is the owner-operator of WPM Public Affairs. Greetings all. So this week we're going to talk about how prepared Canada was for the pandemic. We'll discuss who is right when it comes to the speed of reopening. And finally look at Justin Trudeau and his formal apology to the descendants of Italian Canadians during the Second World War. Now, it's said that to err is human and to blame others is politics. And we had a classic example of that this week with Dominic Cummings, who is Boris Johnson's former chief strategist, now chief adversary, it would seem, who was testifying before parliamentary committees in the UK. And as well as saying that his old friend was unfit for the job, he also said that the UK government's response to the pandemic was slow and chaotic. It was dominated by groupthink and it was run by inept ministers. Now, obviously the backdrop to this was the settling of old scores to some extent. Cummings fell out with Johnson, and he's a bit of a strange individual. Spitting image, the political puppet satire portrays him as an alien from the planet Zargon who inserts ideas into Johnson's head. So it was, you got to take what he said with a pinch of salt, but I do think that it was very revealing of the disorganised response to COVID, and I'm wondering whether, if something similar happened in Canada, which I think it will do, some kind of inquiry, whether the response would be very different. Marcella, do you think we would see a different kind of testimony?
I mean, I hope not. Because it was, and I encourage people to look at the whole interview, because it's an interview or examination, I guess it was, because it's quite startling. I can only speak from my time in a provincial government in terms of the kind of interaction back and forth, between officials and electeds during a crisis, because I've definitely lived through that. I never saw anything remotely near what he was talking about, in terms of, both criticizing not only the political side, for being inept and more worried, obviously, about their electoral fortunes and the covers of the daily newspapers than the actual crisis management itself. But also, he was quite damning of the civil service, in the sense he said, he thought there were a lot of smart civil servants that were never elevated to the senior roles, because those people in the senior roles were just very defensive and not basically bringing up the best and the brightest. I mean, that wasn't my experience in Alberta. That's not to say that it's always seamless between, the electeds and the civil servants in Canada, but I feel like the culture here is a lot different, particularly on the civil servant side. I think we've really, over the decades, tried to empower our public servants to actually bring us the best and the brightest. We've done this through a number of measures. So I'd be kind of shocked if that was equivalent in Canada. But I also think, part of me thinks, I'm sure every government of every stripe had some chaos at the beginning. It just couldn't be helped. And so I guess we'll wait to see what happens in Canada and whether Benedict Cumberbatch is going to come back and do a second movie about Dominic Cummings.
Now, you say that while some of it couldn't be helped, we had the Auditor General out this week talking about personal protective equipment and how it was lacking at the start of our stockpile was lacking at the start of the pandemic, and that this had been warned about for up to 10 years prior to that. Andrew, what do you make of that?
Well, just one quick thing on what happened in the UK yesterday. I thought when he confirmed that the Prime Minister had suggested that he would get injected with COVID on TV, but then he actually got COVID, was quite ironic. However, I mean, the Auditor General's report, would any of us be surprised that we weren't, I didn't think that it was surprising whatsoever that we weren't prepared for a pandemic. If the Auditor General had reported on it differently, I would have been shocked. I don't think that there's a way to have been prepared. I think that we will find out that, we made errors. Of course we made errors. It's an unprecedented thing. Could it have been prevented by having kept supplies and reserves on hand like we should have, or having had some domestic manufacturing capacity of anything? Of course, and I'm sure we'll see those things change, but I don't think that, as far as Auditor General reports go, I didn't think it was incredibly scathing, and it also said that it had been years and years of neglect of governments of all stripes of having neglected to have these stockpiles available.
Well, this was our second report into the pandemic. The first one was relatively flattering to the public service about the way it got income replacement out the door in the form of the CERB, but was critical of the early warning system, which was essentially dismantled and wasn't forward-looking enough. Do you think we need a public inquiry at the end of this to see if there can be lessons learned, Marcella?
I mean, I think we should. Regardless of who would win the next election, I think that it would be better done under a majority government, just because there wouldn't be as much political football played around it. Because I do think we need a serious look at whether our systems are in place, whether the things we have built, the things we have learned, can be sustained and brought forward. Because I don't think this is, unfortunately, going to be the last pandemic in our lifetime.
Right.
I think that I don't think
or there'll
we
be
know.
an earthquake, or there'll be something. Which...
Sure. I mean, what happens? Are we ready? Are we truly ready for a West Coast earthquake?
Right.
I doubt it. So, I do think we need sort of an emergency response inquiry. I don't think it should be necessarily, I don't think it really will be helpful if it's turned into this politically weaponized system where we're basically just interrogating politicians and trying to, stick it to one party or another. It doesn't mean there might not be political, consequences for some of this. But yeah, I think Canadians would expect that we'd have a serious look at this and adjust.
Because my concern is, and I interviewed a senior public servant last month who did not want to be his identity revealed, but he talked about Canada's preparedness and essentially said we were completely unprepared. And the problem, as he saw it, was that superficially we are prepared. I mean, there's an Emergency Management Act, there are emergency management pandemic plans. You can go online and read them. But when the pandemic hit, all of those departmental plans were in a filing cabinet in the Government Operations Centre in Ottawa, and nobody looked at them, and they weren't enacted. And he said that the public service is geared for playing hockey 5-on-5, but if something goes wrong, then they can't handle it. There is no entrepreneurial spirit. There's no sense of acting in a crisis. Public servants, almost by nature, are cautious and therefore try to remain unaccountable. I mean, I think, to me, we need changes to make people, not just to make ministers in the first place, but also public servants accountable for the mistakes they make. What do you think, Andrew?
Well, we've talked about this before, and there are measures in place like at-risk pay for senior public servants. But back to your starting point, if every level of government doesn't do a post-mortem on COVID, we should be alarmed. Every single level of government needs to go and think this through. I mean, we got lucky with SARS, but we didn't get it as bad, but we took learnings from that, and that's why we have all these provincial public health officers. And, using Ontario as an example, I mean, perhaps having 900 different local public health authorities is a bad idea, and maybe that made it so that things didn't work out well. But if you don't do a significant post-mortem on it, and we have to give some significant thought to how that's structured. And like, instead of doing if you look at it federally, like appointing Anne McClellan to chair another thing, like that's just not going to, and she's brilliant and I love the lady, but I just mean, like, we actually need to think about the process of this and make sure that these studies mean something and something's going to come out of it. Just going and putting a bunch of eminent Canadians who know nothing about this stuff to go and do a study. I'm not suggesting we need a big Crown Commission, but maybe we do.
Yeah. Okay, well, we're looking back because at least it looks like the end is in sight. And most provinces have now announced their reopening plans. Theresa Tam, the Chief Public Health Officer, would like 75% of the people to have had both doses. before we return to normal. That does not, at the moment, that's only 5%, so we're some ways from that. That doesn't seem to be Jason Kenney's plan. He's announced that come this Calgary Stampede, it's giddy up and we're back to normal. What do you think, Marcella?
I mean, right now, I wouldn't take $1 million to go to a full Stampede right now, and I love the Stampede. So,
well, can I just ask you this, because I was intrigued by this. Your former boss, Rachel Notley, said, Yahoo, let's invite 100,000 people to the fairground. Do 100,000 people go?
Oh, yeah. It's a complete gong show for 10 straight days. Half the city works a few hours in the morning, but mainly everyone's either recovering from a hangover or on their way to getting one. Those who drink and those who don't probably overdo it on the pancakes. Like, it's a very all-encompassing. The whole city turns out. There's millions of people that come either for a day or two, but from all over the world. I love it. It's kind of like adult Disneyland, with a lot of kids also enjoying a Disneyland type environment. But I just feel like when he was talking about that, like, I clenched, because, Stampede comes with its own social problems, right? The idea of, again, excessive drinking. We always have to prepare for the sexual harassment, assault stuff that goes on. And I just don't see how, on top of that, you're going to add COVID restrictions. Like, it just doesn't make any sense to me. But I think the thing about the reopening is, I feel like I'm nervous, right? Because we're going to have a patchwork of reopening across the country. People are anxious. I, for one, would love to see my parents, who I haven't seen in over a year. But I'm hesitant to say I can travel to BC in September or October, even though everyone's saying, well, that should be fine. And then we've got this variant question, whether there's going to be other variants arriving.
Yeah, I mean, we've still got 1,000 cases a day in Ontario, 500 people on ventilators, and this thing is not done yet, Andrew.
No, and you even look at today, like the good people of Prince Edward Island released their reopening plan, where they've had no COVID, and they're being much more cautious than Alberta, who's had tons of it, who still, as of last night, is still the fifth on the list of North American COVID per capita. And they're opening on Tuesday. It seems a bit aggressive. But I mean, we say that, and people are looking down their nose at Alberta, but BC's already allowing indoor dining. So,
but BC's final is a 4-stage plan. It doesn't come restriction-free until Labour Day. So, but I take your point. Anyway, we're running out of time here, so let's move on quickly. Justin Trudeau has apologised to the descendants of Italian Canadians interned during the Second World War. What do we make of that, Marcella?
Well, I think those families deserve the apology, and I think lots of Italian Canadians who are affected by that, or whose grandparents were affected by that, have wanted some kind of statement. And I think, we have to remember that there were people holding fascist beliefs in this country during that period that didn't happen to be immigrants from any of the Axis countries that weren't interned for those beliefs. I'm sure some of them were being monitored by the RCMP as well, but they weren't sort of rounded up as a group and stuck in these internment camps.
My former colleague Michael Petro wrote a piece, though, saying that this is an overly broad narrative of ethnic victimhood, pointing out that many of them were interned because they were active and enthusiastic local fascists.
Well, then release the reports, if that's true, right? Prove to their families that there was a viable threat there. But my point being, and what I took offense to, not offense, but what I take issue with there is they were ethnically rounding up people. They were rounding you up based on, where you immigrated from and whether those countries happen to be a part of the Axis. And I get it, sort of. But I do think the descendants deserve apologies. And we're now hearing from some people, like some of these men that were locked up for 2 or 3 years had clearly had, there was one that was a journalist, and his paper was very progressive and very anti-fascist. So, riddle me that.
Right. Andrew, there does seem to be the hint of an election in the air. I mean, Trudeau has gone to the empathy well again. It's part of his personal brand that he's always for the underdog, as long as everybody knows that he's the top dog. And he's brought himself to tears again. Is this an election gambit?
I mean, obviously, traditionally, Italian Canadians are a liberal voting bloc. It's also significant that this was put forward by the first ever Italian Canadian Justice Minister / Attorney General. But yeah, this is good politics. I think also, I mean, I don't know this to be true, but I think that it is entertaining to me to watch, like, you know, Canada's done some bad things, and Justin Trudeau has apologized for a lot of them. And every time he does an apology, it drives the right insane. So I picture in my mind there being people in PMO who are just out like trolling the nutters on Twitter by doing this stuff. But
while he is very able at apologizing for things that happened before he was born, he's not so adept at apologising for mistakes that he's made in his own administration, such as the SNC case where he said he was merely protecting jobs. I think the last word going to me, I wrote a book about this, so the idea that there's never any admission that lines were crossed because the rightness of his agenda means that he discounts behaviour in himself that he would not tolerate in others. And therefore to err is human, but to blame others is politics. So let's leave it there. Thanks, guys.
Take care.
Speak to you again next week.
Ciao.